The emergency beacon cut through the void of space like a desperate scream. Ambassador Ra of the Galactic Council pressed her six-fingered hand against the cold metal console, watching the red warning lights flash across her command center. The message was simple, but its implications sent chills down her elongated spine. SOS defense lines broken enemy advancing toward core worlds, requesting immediate human military assistance. Situation critical. She had not spoken to a human in over 300 standard years. None of them had. The Great Withdrawal had changed everything. After the siege of Andromeda Prime, after the humans had saved every sentient species in the galaxy from the Void Swarm, they had simply left, packed up their massive fleets, their incredible weapons, and their terrifyingly efficient soldiers, and retreated to the outer rim territories they called home. The other species had been relieved, if Ra was being honest. The humans were effective allies, but they were also utterly terrifying. They fought with a savage intensity that made even the warrior races of the Imperium uncomfortable. They had weapons that could crack planets and soldiers who laughed while charging into certain death. When they saved the galaxy, they did it with such overwhelming violence that many species began to fear their saviors more than the enemy they had defeated. So when humanity announced their withdrawal from galactic affairs, most of the Council had quietly celebrated. Let the humans keep to their corner of space. The galaxy would manage just fine without their frightening efficiency at warfare. That had been 3 centuries ago. 3 centuries of peace, prosperity, and the slow, comfortable assumption that the galaxy's problems could be solved through diplomacy and careful resource management. The various species had grown soft, Ra realized now. Their militaries had become ceremonial. Their weapons were designed for show rather than war. They had forgotten what real conflict looked like. The had reminded them. The species had appeared 6 months ago at the galaxy's edge, their black ships emerging from dark space like nightmares made manifest. They communicated only through action, and their actions spoke of a single, terrible desire, the complete extermination of all other sentient life. They had no interest in territory, resources, or negotiation. They simply killed everything they encountered and moved on to the next system. The first response had been diplomatic. Ambassador teams had been dispatched to establish communication. The had responded by completely sterilizing the worlds those ambassadors had launched from, turning billions of souls into floating ash in the void. The second response had been military. The combined fleets of the Galactic Council had engaged the Armada at the Battle of Skate. It had lasted exactly 47 minutes. Of the 2,000 ships that had engaged the enemy, 38 had returned, most of them heavily damaged and carrying tailies of weapons that seemed to ignore shields and armor entirely. Now the defense line, the last major fortification between the and the core worlds, had fallen. In 6 days, maybe less, the enemy would reach Galactic Council space proper. They would reach worlds where lived in peaceful cities, where children played in gardens, where poets wrote verses about the beauty of interstellar cooperation. Ra stood slowly, her ceremonial robes rustling in the artificial gravity of the command center. Around her, dozens of council staff members worked frantically at their stations, coordinating evacuation efforts and trying to establish defensive positions with ships and weapons that had been designed for peacekeeping, not war. "Ma'am," came a voice from behind her. Sub-Administrator I approached, his blue-skinned features tight with stress. "We've received confirmation from the outer monitoring stations. The fleet has begun moving again. Our analysts estimate they'll reach the junction in 72 hours. Junction was a hub world, home to nearly 50 billion souls from a dozen different species. It was also the gateway to the core systems, including Council Prime itself. "Have we heard anything from the evacuation fleets?" Ra asked, though she already knew the answer from I's expression. "The civilian transports are moving as fast as they can, but..." He gestured helplessly at the tactical display. "There's nowhere for them to go, ma'am. Every system within range is already overcrowded with refugees from the previous attacks. And even if we could evacuate Junction in time, they will just follow the ships to wherever they flee." Ra nodded grimly. She had known this moment would come, had known it from the first reports of the attacks. The Galactic Council, for all its noble ideals and sophisticated technology, was simply not equipped to fight a war of extermination against an enemy that seemed to possess weapons decades ahead of their own. There was only one option left, one terrible, necessary option that she had been avoiding for months. "Send the message," she said quietly. Ma'am, the emergency beacon to human space, send it now. I's face went pale. Ambassador, with respect, the humans made their position very clear during the withdrawal. They want nothing to do with galactic politics. They've ignored every attempt at communication for the past 3 centuries. What makes you think they'll respond now? Ra walked to the main viewport and stared out at the stars. Somewhere among those distant lights, the fleet was advancing like a wave of death. And somewhere else, in the territories they had claimed beyond the galactic rim, the humans were living their isolated lives. Because, she said softly, they're still human, and humans, for all their frightening qualities, have one trait that surpasses all others. She turned back to face her aide. They cannot stand by and watch others suffer when they have the power to help. I looked skeptical, but he moved to his console and began preparing the transmission. As he worked, Ra continued staring out at the void. She remembered the humans from the war against the Void Swarm. Remembered their admiral, a small woman with steel in her eyes who had calmly planned the destruction of enemies that her fleet by 10-1. Remembered Captain, who had led the famous charge at Station, his troops singing battle songs as they threw themselves against impossible odds. Remembered the human civilian populations, who had worked 20-hour days in their factories to build the weapons that had saved them all. But mostly she remembered the evacuation of Talarzeth. The Void Swarm had broken through the outer defenses, and 12 billion civilians had been trapped on there. The Council fleets had been forced to retreat, abandoning the system to its fate. But the human Third Fleet had remained behind, holding the line against overwhelming odds while civilian transports fled to safety. They had saved every single life, even though it meant the complete destruction of their own fleet. When asked why they had sacrificed so much for aliens they barely knew, Admiral Reeves had simply said, because it was the right thing to do. That was what she was counting on now, that somewhere in their self-imposed exile, the humans were still human. Message prepared, ma'am, I reported. Send it, Ra ordered. The transmission burst outward at faster-than-light speeds, carrying a simple message toward the outer rim territories. It contained the current tactical situation, casualty reports, and a desperate plea for assistance. But mostly, it carried 3 words that the Galactic Council had never thought they would need to send. Please help us. Days passed. They continued their advance, smashing through the hastily erected defensive positions like they were made of paper. Junction fell exactly on schedule, its 50 billion inhabitants killed in less than 6 hours. The civilian evacuation fleet scattered in panic, trying to find safe harbor in a galaxy that seemed to have no safe places left. And the humans remained silent. Some council members began to speak of surrender, though no one knew if they would even accept such a thing. Others advocated for a final desperate defense at Council Prime, throwing everything they had left into one last battle. A few suggested fleeing beyond the galactic rim entirely, abandoning their home and hopping to find refuge in the void between galaxies. Ra refused to give up hope. Every day, she stood in the communications center, watching the receivers for any sign of a response. Her staff began to look at her with pity, then with concern for her mental state. Even I eventually suggested that it might be time to accept reality. They're not coming, ma'am, he said gently on the 7th day after the transmission. Perhaps they never received the message, or perhaps they simply don't care what happens to us anymore. But Ra shook her head. They received it, she said with quiet certainty, and they care, they're just deciding what to do about it. She was right. On the 8th day, as the fleet approached the systems, a new signal appeared on the long-range sensors. At first, the technicians thought it was an error. Then they thought it was some kind of sensor ghost or electromagnetic anomaly. The readings simply made no sense. Ma'am, the chief sensor operator called out, his voice tight with confusion. I'm detecting something at the edge of our sensor range. It's massive, bigger than anything in our databases. Ra rushed to the sensor station, her heart's pounding. Show me. The main display flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional map of local space. At the very edge of sensor range, a single contact blinked red. The computer was struggling to process its size and mass readings. Computer estimates the contact at approximately 2,000 kilometers in length, the operator reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Mass equivalent to a small moon, and it's accelerating toward us at 0.7 light speed. A hush fell over the command center. Nothing that large should be able to move that fast. The energy requirements alone should have been impossible. Are there any more contacts? Ra asked. The operator ran a deeper scan, then slowly shook his head. Just the one, ma'am, but... He paused, running the scan again. Ma'am, I'm detecting a transmission from the contact. It's using old council diplomatic frequencies. Put it through, Ra ordered. The speakers crackled to life, and a voice filled the command center. It was human, deep and gravelly with age, but unmistakably human. Galactic Council Command, this is Admiral of the Human Federation vessel Titan's Wrath. We received your message. There was a pause, and Ra could hear what sounded like weapon systems powering up in the background. We're coming in fast and loud. Suggest you clear all friendly forces from our approach vector. Another pause. When the human spoke again, there was something in his voice that made every being in the command center go perfectly still. It was the sound of controlled rage, of fury so intense it had become cold and calculating. We hear you've got an extermination problem. Well, you called the right people. We've gotten very good at exterminating things that need exterminating. The transmission cut off, leaving the command center in absolute silence. Ra stared at the sensor display, watching that impossible red dot grow larger as it approached. After 300 years, the humans were coming back to war, and from the sound of Admiral's voice, they had not forgotten how to fight. They were about to discover what it meant to face an angry human fleet. Ra almost felt sorry for them. Almost, the Titan's wrath dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system like a mountain falling from the sky. Ambassador, Ra had seen the largest vessels in the Council fleets, massive dreadnoughts that stretched for kilometers and housed tens of thousands of crew members. This human ship made them look like children's toys. The vessel easy description. It was clearly built for war, every line and surface designed for maximum destructive efficiency. Weapon ports dotted its hull like the eyes of some vast predator, and massive engine arrays at its stern glowed with barely contained energy. But what struck Ra most was how it moved. Despite its enormous size, the ship maneuvered through space with an almost organic grace, as if it were alive. "My God," whispered Chief Analyst, a veteran of 40 years in the Council's Military Intelligence Division. "How is something that large even possible? The structural stress alone should tear it apart." Ra said nothing. She was too busy staring at the tactical display, watching as new contacts began appearing around the massive flagship. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of smaller vessels materialized as they dropped out of their own FTL jumps. Sleek destroyers, heavily armed cruisers, and ship types that the Council's computers couldn't even identify began forming a battle formation that stretched across millions of cubic kilometers of space. "Ma'am," Sub-Administrator I called out from his station, his voice tight with amazement. "I'm reading approximately 8,000 vessels in the human fleet, their combined firepower." He paused, running the calculations again. "Ma'am, they have more destructive capacity than our entire galactic defense force, combined, and that's not counting whatever weapons that flagship is carrying." The communications board lit up with incoming signals from across the system. Council defense stations, civilian observation posts, and military outposts were all reporting the same thing. The humans had arrived, and they had brought enough firepower to level entire star systems. "Ambassador Ra," the deep voice of Admiral filled the command center again. "Permission to approach Council Command. We need to coordinate our response to the threat." "Permission granted, Admiral," Ra replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "We'll have our best tactical officers standing by for briefing." "That won't be necessary," replied. "We've been monitoring communications and combat patterns for the past 6 months. We know what they are, how they fight, and what they want. What we need from you is current disposition of civilian populations and any intelligence on their command structure." Ra felt a chill run down her spine. "Admiral, are you saying you've been watching this conflict from the beginning?" There was a long pause before answered. When he spoke again, his voice was even colder than before. "Ma'am, we've been watching everything that happens in this galaxy for the past 300 years. We from galactic politics, not from galactic awareness. We knew about the day they first appeared." "Then why didn't you intervene sooner?" The question came from I, though he looked immediately at his own boldness in questioning a human admiral. His response was quiet but carried clearly over the comm system. "Because you never asked. We made a promise when we would not interfere in galactic affairs unless specifically requested. We kept that promise even when it was difficult to do so. The weight of those words settled over the command center like a heavy blanket. The humans had been watching. They had seen the first attacks, the failed diplomatic missions, the devastating military defeats. They had the power to intervene at any time, but they had waited for an invitation that had taken months to arrive. Ra thought about the billions who had died in that time, and felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. "Admiral," she managed to say, "we're transmitting all available tactical data on the forces now. What do you need from us?" "Just stay out of our way," replied, "and be ready to coordinate refugee movements when this is over. We're going to make a lot of noise, and they might try to take it out on civilian targets in retaliation." The Titan's wrath moved deeper into the system, its massive bulk accompanied by the seemingly endless stream of escort vessels. As they passed Council observation stations, the human ships began broadcasting detailed tactical information to their own fleet elements. The coordination was flawless, each vessel knowing exactly where to position itself for maximum effectiveness. But it wasn't just the ships that impressed Ra, it was the soldiers. As the human fleet moved past a civilian refugee convoy, one of their destroyers detected a mechanical failure in a transport carrying 30,000 refugees. Without being asked, the human ship immediately dispatched a repair shuttle and a team of engineers. Within hours, the transport was operational again and continuing toward safety. When a group of lost civilian vessels sent out a distress call from an asteroid field, 3 human cruisers immediately broke formation to provide escort, despite the tactical disadvantage of dividing their forces. When a medical emergency broke out on a refugee ship, human medics were on scene within minutes, bringing medical technology that was centuries ahead of anything the Council possessed. This was what Ra remembered about humans. They fought like devils, but they also possessed a compassion that was almost overwhelming in its scope. They would literally die to save strangers, and they would do it without expecting thanks or recognition. "Ma'am," Chief Analyst called out, interrupting her thoughts. "The fleet has changed course. They're heading directly for the human formation." Ra looked at the tactical display and felt her blood run cold. They had been advancing methodically through the galaxy, taking systems one at a time and consolidating their gains. But now they were abandoning that careful approach and rushing their entire fleet toward the human battle group. "How long until they engage?" she asked. "Approximately 6 hours at their current speed," replied. "Admiral, they're bringing their entire force. Everything they've shown us, plus reserves that our scouts estimate at another 2,000 vessels." Ra did the math in her head. They outnumbered the humans by more than 3-1, and their ships had proven capable of destroying Council vessels that should have been technologically superior. The humans were walking into a battle that could very well destroy them entirely. She opened a communication channel to the Titan's wrath. "Admiral, our tactical analysis suggests they will engage you with overwhelming force. They appear to be committing their entire fleet to this battle." His response was immediate and utterly calm. "Copy that, Ambassador. We're seeing the same thing on our scopes." "Admiral, they outnumber you significantly. Perhaps a fighting withdrawal would be more prudent. We could establish fallback positions." "Negative," cut her off. "We didn't come here to run away from these things. We came here to end them." There was something in his tone that made Ra's mouth go dry. It wasn't bravado or false confidence. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. "All fleet elements," his voice carried across all communication channels, reaching not just the human ships but every Council vessel and station in the system. "They are inbound. This is what we came here to do. Time to remind the galaxy why our enemies have nightmares about humanity." The human fleet began to move, 8,000 vessels spreading out into a formation that seemed to cover half the system. But as they moved, something extraordinary began to happen. The ships began to change. Weapon ports that had been hidden beneath armored plating began to open, revealing guns that seemed impossibly large. Shield generators came online, creating energy barriers that made the space around each vessel shimmer like heat waves. And from the largest ships, including the Titan's Wrath, launch bays began to open, revealing fighter craft in numbers that belief. "Ma'am," the sensor operator called out, his voice cracking with stress. I'm reading massive energy buildup from the human fleet. Their power signatures are off the charts, and the fighter craft." He paused, running the count again. "Ma'am, the Titan's Wrath alone has launched over 10,000 fighters." 10,000 fighters from a single ship. Ra tried to wrap her mind around the logistics involved. The Titan's Wrath would need to house, fuel, arm, and crew more fighter craft than most species had in their entire military. And it was just the flagship. The other capital ships in the fleet were launching their own massive fighter wings. "How is this possible?" I whispered. "The resource requirements alone." "They've had 300 years to prepare," Ra said quietly. 300 years of technological advancement, shipbuilding, and military planning without any outside interference. While we grew complacent in peace, they never stopped getting ready for war. As if to prove her point, the tactical sensors began detecting something new from the human fleet. Energy signatures unlike anything in the Council's database began appearing throughout their formation. New weapon types, shield configurations, and propulsion systems that seemed to ignore the known laws of physics. "Ma'am," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a general broadcast from the human fleet. It's being sent on all frequencies, including communication bands." "Put it through," Ra ordered. Admiral's voice filled not just the command center, but every ship, station, and communication device in the system. It was also being broadcast directly to the incoming fleet. "Attention forces, this is Admiral of the Human Federation Fleet. You have committed acts of genocide against innocent species under the protection of the Galactic Council. You have slaughtered billions of defenseless civilians. You have ignored all attempts at peaceful resolution." His voice grew colder, more dangerous. "By the laws of war as recognized by the Human Federation, your species has forfeited any claim to mercy or quarter." The transmission paused for a moment. When continued, there was something in his voice that made even the seasoned military officers in the Council Command Center unconsciously step back from their consoles. 300 years ago, we from Galactic Affairs because we were told our methods were too harsh. We were told that civilized species don't need to resort to total war. We were told that diplomacy and restraint were the tools of advanced societies." Another pause. "You have proven those people wrong." On the tactical display, the human fleet completed its deployment. 8,000 warships arranged in a formation that somehow managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. At their center, the Titan's Wrath hung in space like a dark star, its massive bulk crackling with barely contained energy. "We are humanity," his voice continued, now being heard across the galaxy as news networks picked up the transmission. "We are the species that crawled out of the caves and reached for the stars. We are the species that turned rocks into tools, tools into weapons, and weapons into the instruments of justice. We have been preparing for this moment for 3 centuries." The fleet appeared on the edge of sensor range, black ships moving in perfect formation toward the human battle line. They showed no hesitation, no fear, no recognition that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly across the void. "You wanted to exterminate the innocent. You wanted to bathe the galaxy in blood. You wanted to prove that only the strong deserve to survive." The pause this time seemed to last forever. "Congratulations, you've gotten our attention." The transmission ended, leaving the system in absolute silence except for the background hum of starship engines and the soft beeping of sensor equipment. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of what was about to happen seemed to press down on everyone present. Then, from somewhere deep in the bowels of the Titan's Wrath, came a sound that made Ra's blood freeze. It was low, rhythmic, and utterly human. It was the sound of 8,000 voices raised in song, a battle hymn that had been silent for 3 centuries. The humans were ready to go to war again, and the galaxy was about to remember why that was something their enemies should fear above all else. The battle began at exactly 1437 Standard Galactic Time, and it started in a way that no one expected. The fleet, 10,000 strong and moving in perfect formation, suddenly stopped. Not slowed, not altered course, stopped completely, as if they had hit an invisible wall in space. For nearly a full minute, their ships hung motionless in the void while their sensors presumably tried to understand what had happened. Ambassador Ra stared at the tactical display in confusion. What just happened? Why did they stop? Chief Analyst was frantically working his console, trying to make sense of the sensor readings. Ma'am, I'm detecting massive gravitational anomalies throughout the formation. It's like they're caught in some kind of artificial gravity well, but I can't locate the source. From the communications system, Admiral's calm voice provided the answer. Gravity mines, Ambassador. We've had 300 years to think about how to stop a fleet that size. Sometimes the old-fashioned solutions work best. On the display, the space around the trapped fleet began to shimmer with strange energy patterns. The humans had somehow weaponized gravity itself, creating invisible snares that could stop entire fleets in their tracks. But they were not helpless. Their ships began to glow with an eerie purple light, and slowly, painfully, they began to move again. Whatever technology they were using to escape the gravity wells was clearly taxing their systems, but it was working. Impressive, his voice commented, as if he were watching an academic exercise rather than a battle for the fate of the galaxy. Most species would have been trapped by those mines for hours. These things adapted in under 2 minutes. The freed ships immediately opened fire on the human fleet. Their weapons were beams of pure darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. When they struck the human shields, the protective barriers flickered and sparked, clearly being pushed to their limits. But the humans didn't return fire, not yet. Instead, something even more extraordinary happened. The human fleet began to sing. 8,000 ships, millions of crew members, all joined their voices in a battle hymn that was broadcast across every frequency. It wasn't just sound. Somehow, the humans had found a way to turn their war songs into an actual weapon. The sonic patterns created interference in the ship's communication systems, disrupted their targeting computers, and seemed to cause actual physical vibrations in their hull plating. "My God," whispered I, "they're using music as a weapon." They responded by increasing their rate of fire, pouring more of those terrible dark beams into the human formation. Several smaller human vessels were overwhelmed, their shields failing and their hulls beginning to buckle under the assault. And then Admiral gave the order that changed everything. "All vessels, weapons free. Show them what we learned during the long peace." The human fleet opened fire. What followed was unlike anything in galactic military history. The humans didn't just shoot at the enemy, they painted space itself with violence. Beam weapons that seemed to bend reality around their targets. Missile volleys that numbered in the millions, each warhead guided by artificial intelligences smarter than most organic species. Energy weapons that could turn matter back into base particles. But the most terrifying weapons came from the Titan's wrath itself. The massive flagship fired what looked like a single beam of silver light toward the center of the formation. Where it struck, enemy ships simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, they just stopped being there, as if they had been edited out of reality itself. "What kind of weapon is that?" Ra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Quantum disruptor," Kame's casual reply. "We call it the Galaxy Eraser. Took us about 50 years to figure out how to build one that wouldn't accidentally delete the local star system." The formation began to waver as hundreds of their ships vanished under the human assault. But they were far from defeated. Their own weapons were finding their mark, and several human cruisers exploded in brilliant fireballs as their reactors were breached. More importantly, they were adapting. Their ships began to spread out, making it harder for the quantum disruptors to take out multiple vessels with each shot. Their own weapons increased in power, and some of them began firing projectiles that seemed to ignore the laws of physics entirely. "Ma'am," called out urgently, "they are launching some kind of boarding pods. They're heading directly for the human capital ships." On the display, thousands of small craft detached from the fleet and began racing toward the human lines. They moved in impossible patterns, teleporting short distances and phasing in and out of normal space to avoid the defensive fire. Several pods reached their targets, attaching themselves to human ship hulls and beginning to cut their way inside. For the first time since the battle began, his voice carried a note of concern. "All ships prepare for boarding actions. Marines to battle stations. Lock and load, people, we're about to have company." What happened next reminded the galaxy why humans had been so feared during the war against the Void Swarm. The boarding actions that followed were brief, violent, and utterly one-sided. The sounds that came over the communication channels were unlike anything Ra had ever heard: the screams of alien attackers, the thunderous roar of human weapons, and underneath it all, the war cries of human soldiers doing what they did best. Boarding parties neutralized, came a report from one of the human captains, his voice breathing heavily but triumphant. Are tough, but they don't know how to fight humans in close quarters. My Marines are asking if they can keep some of the enemy weapons as souvenirs. The battle raged on for hours. They threw everything they had at the human fleet: energy weapons that could melt asteroid belts, kinetic projectiles moving at significant percentages of light speed, and exotic weapons that seemed to attack the very concept of matter itself. The humans responded with equal ferocity, unveiling new weapons and tactics that they had apparently been developing for centuries. Both fleets took terrible losses. The space between them became a graveyard of shattered ships and floating debris. But slowly, inevitably, the tide began to turn in humanity's favor. "Ma'am," the sensor operator reported, his voice tight with amazement, "the human ships are regenerating. Their damaged vessels are actually repairing themselves." Ra looked at the display and saw that he was right. Human ships that had been badly damaged were suddenly sprouting new armor plating, regrowing destroyed weapon systems, and restoring their shields to full strength. It was as if the ships themselves were alive and healing from their wounds. "Nanotechnology," explained when she asked about it. "Every human ship carries billions of construction. As long as we have raw materials and space battles provide plenty of debris, we can rebuild ourselves faster than most enemies can damage us." They seemed to realize this too. Their formation began to collapse as individual ship commanders started trying to retreat, but the humans weren't letting them go. "All vessels, pursuit pattern Delta," ordered. "We're not done here yet. I want to make sure this problem never troubles the galaxy again." What followed was less of a battle and more of an extermination. The human ships pursued the fleeing with relentless efficiency, running down every enemy vessel and destroying it completely. There were no surrender offers, no quarter given, no mercy shown. The humans had apparently decided that they represented an existential threat that needed to be eliminated entirely. "Admiral," Ra found herself saying over the communication channel, "surely some of them could be taken prisoner for study. We know so little about their technology or their motivations." His response was immediate and final. "Negative, Ambassador. We've been monitoring their communications throughout this conflict. They're actively enjoying the suffering they cause. They see the pain of other species as entertainment." His voice grew even colder. "We've seen what happens when you show mercy to enemies like that. It doesn't end well." The last ship was destroyed 3 hours after the battle began. As its burning hull drifted apart in the void, an eerie silence fell over the star system. After months of living in terror of an unstoppable enemy, the threat was simply gone. But the humans weren't finished. "Fleet elements designated for pursuit operations prepare for long-range deployment," announced. "We're going to track them back to whatever hole they crawled out of and make sure there are no more of them out there." "Admiral," Ra said quickly, "that could take you far beyond galactic space. The Council can't provide support or backup at those distances." "We don't need backup, ma'am. We need to make sure this never happens again. They came from somewhere, and they might not have been the only ones of their kind." Paused for a moment. "We're going to follow their trail back to its source and eliminate any remaining threat. It might take us years, but we'll make sure the galaxy is safe." As the human fleet began to reorganize itself for long-range operations, Ra realized that she was witnessing something historic. Not just the defeat but the return of humanity to galactic affairs. They had come back to war, and they had reminded everyone why they were the most feared species in known space. But she was also seeing something else, something that gave her hope for the future. The humans had not attacked the Council species when they returned. They had not demanded territorial concessions or political control. They had simply answered a call for help, eliminated a threat, and were now preparing to make sure that threat could never return. They were still the same humans who had saved the galaxy from the void swarm 3 centuries ago. Terrifyingly efficient in war, but driven by a moral code that put the protection of innocence above all else. "Admiral," she said over the communication channel, "on behalf of the Galactic Council and all the species you've saved today, thank you." His response was quiet, almost humble. "Just doing our job, ma'am. It's what we signed up for when we became the ones with the big guns. With great firepower comes great responsibility." The human fleet began to move toward the edge of the system, heading into the unknown depths of space to hunt down any remaining traces of the threat. As they departed, They left behind a galaxy that would never again make the mistake of believing that peace could be maintained without strength. The humans were back, and the universe was safer for it. 6 months after the Battle of, Ambassador Ra found herself in a situation she had never expected to face, negotiating with humans who didn't want anything from her. The Galactic Council's emergency session had been called to address what many species were calling the human problem. In the half-year since Admiral's fleet had departed to hunt down the remaining, reports had been flooding in from across the galaxy. Human ships were appearing everywhere, often without warning, always without permission. They had been spotted in the Andromeda Spiral, investigating ancient ruins that the archaeologists had deemed too dangerous to explore. They had established research stations in the dead zones, regions of space that no other species dared to enter due to exotic radiation. Most concerning of all, they had been detected building what appeared to be massive installations in the void between galaxies, far beyond any known star system. "They're everywhere," complained Ambassador On of the Imperium, his scaled features twisted with frustration. "Our patrol fleets encounter them daily. They ignore our territorial claims, refuse to respond to standard communications, and when we demand explanations, they simply disappear." "The humans have clearly violated the Outer Sector Accords," added Representative Ash from the Merchant Coalition. "Their ships have been detected in at least 47 restricted systems. Some of these areas have been off-limits for centuries due to dangerous phenomena or protected archaeological sites." Ra listened to the complaints with growing unease. She had been the one to call the humans back to war. If they were now causing problems across the galaxy, the responsibility was partly hers. "Have any of these human vessels actually attacked Council ships or civilian traffic?" she asked. The chamber fell silent for a moment before ungrudgingly answered. "No, they haven't shown any hostile intent, but their presence is unsettling. Our crews report that human ships appear out of nowhere, observe them silently, then vanish without explanation. Some of our captains are requesting transfers rather than face these encounters." "Furthermore," Ash continued, "the humans appear to be engaged in large-scale construction projects using resources from unclaimed systems. They're strip-mining entire asteroid belts and processing the materials with technology we can't identify. Our economists estimate they're consuming raw materials at a rate equivalent to the entire Council's industrial output." Before Ra could respond, the chamber's communication system activated. A familiar voice filled the space, causing several ambassadors to visibly flinch. "Galactic Council, this is Admiral. I understand you've called a session to discuss human activities in the galaxy. With your permission, I'd like to address your concerns." The chamber erupted in surprised chatter. The humans had somehow been monitoring their supposedly secure communications and was requesting permission to speak rather than simply forcing his way into the conversation. Council Speaker, an elderly whose tenure stretched back nearly 2 centuries, called for order. "Admiral, you have the Council's permission to speak. However, we must express our concern about your fleet's activities throughout galactic space." His response carried a note of mild amusement. "Understood, Speaker. I'm transmitting our current coordinates if you'd like to send a diplomatic vessel for a face-to-face meeting. I think it would be easier to address your concerns in person." The coordinates that appeared on the chamber's main display caused a collective gasp. The humans were located in the Magellan Void, a region of empty space more than 3 million light-years from the galactic rim. No known species had ever traveled so far from home. "Admiral," Speaker said carefully, "those coordinates place you far beyond the edge of known space. What possible purpose could you have in such a remote location?" "We found them, Speaker," replied, his voice growing serious. "We found where they came from, and we found out they weren't alone." The implications of those words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Ra felt her blood run cold as she realized what was suggesting. There hadn't been a single, isolated threat. They had been scouts for something larger. "Admiral," she said, standing slowly, "what exactly did you find out there?" His pause lasted long enough that several ambassadors began to fidget nervously. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "There were refugees, Ambassador Ra. They were running from something that had destroyed their home galaxy. When they couldn't find a way to escape it, they decided to clear out this galaxy for their own use. They were preparing it as a fallback position." "Running from what?" Speaker asked. We're still gathering information on that. What we can tell you is that it's big, it's hostile, and it's approximately 50,000 light-years away and closing on the galactic rim. His tone became grimly professional. Conservative estimates suggest it will reach our outer systems in approximately 200 years. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Just as they were recovering from one existential threat, the humans were telling them about another one that made the look like a minor annoyance. "This is why you've been building installations in deep space," Ra said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're preparing for another war." "Not just preparing for it," corrected. "We're making sure it never reaches the galaxy. We're going to meet this threat in the void between galaxies and stop it there." Representative Ash leaned forward in his seat. "Admiral, with all due respect, you're talking about defending a front that spans millions of light years. Even with your advanced technology, surely that's impossible." His chuckle was dark with humor. "Ma'am, 300 years ago, you told us that our methods were too extreme for civilized warfare, that we needed to learn restraint and proportional response. We've spent those 3 centuries learning how to build weapons and strategies that make our old methods look like children's games." "What kind of weapons?" On demanded. "The kind that can sterilize star clusters," replied casually. "The kind that can create artificial black holes and use them as defensive barriers. The kind that can turn empty space itself into a weapon." His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "The kind that should never be used anywhere near inhabited worlds." The chamber was silent as the implications sank in. The humans had spent 3 centuries of isolation developing weapons that could destroy entire regions of space. They were preparing for a war that would make the recent conflict look like a minor skirmish. "Admiral," Speaker said slowly, "surely the Council should be involved in planning for this threat. Our combined resources and knowledge could be invaluable." "With respect, Speaker, we don't need your resources, and frankly, we don't want your involvement." His tone became blunt. "This is going to be a war of extermination fought with weapons that violate most of your ethical guidelines. You told us to leave because our methods were too harsh. This conflict is going to make those methods look gentle." Ra stood again. "Admiral, you can't simply decide to fight this war alone. If this threat is as serious as you suggest, it affects all species in the galaxy." "Which is exactly why we're handling it ourselves," replied. "Because if we fail, you'll all be dead anyway. And if we succeed using the methods necessary to win, you'll spend the next 1,000 years trying to put us on trial for war crimes." The brutal honesty of his words cut through the chamber like a blade. The humans were preparing to commit acts of warfare so terrible that they didn't even want witnesses, let alone allies. "What do you want from us?" Ra asked. "Nothing," said simply. "Continue living your lives, build your civilizations, create art, explore science, raise your children. We'll handle the monsters in the dark." "And if you lose?" Representative Ash asked quietly. His pause was brief but telling. "Then you'll have about 6 months to evacuate as many people as possible to whatever refuge you can find beyond the galactic rim, but we're not planning to lose." Speaker cleared his throat. "Admiral, the Council appreciates humanity's dedication to galactic defense. However, we must insist on some form of oversight or coordination. Surely you understand our concern about weapons capable of destroying star systems being deployed without any external control." His response was immediate and final. "Negative, Speaker. We tried external control 3 centuries ago. We tried fighting wars by committee, following rules of engagement written by species that had never faced real existential threats. The result was longer conflicts, higher casualties, and enemies who learned to exploit our self-imposed limitations." "Admiral," began. "Speaker, let me be clear," interrupted. "We're not asking for permission, authorization, or approval. We're informing you of the situation as a courtesy. We will handle this threat using whatever methods are necessary, regardless of how the Council feels about those methods." The chamber erupted in angry voices as various ambassadors began arguing among themselves. Some demanded that the humans be stopped, others insisted on joint planning committees, and a few suggested that humanity should be expelled from galactic space entirely. Ra listened to the chaos and felt a deep sadness settle over her. 300 years ago, the galaxy's civilized species had rejected humanity's help because their methods were too violent. Now those same species wanted to dictate terms to the humans who were preparing to save them all again. Admiral, she said, her voice cutting through the argument. On behalf of the Galactic Council, I want to thank you for the warning, and I want you to know that at least some of us understand why you're taking this approach. His response was surprisingly gentle. Thank you, Ambassador. That means more than you know. He paused. For what it's worth, we're not doing this out of anger or spite. We're doing it because it's necessary, because someone has to be willing to make the hard choices and live with the consequences. Will we see you again before this new threat arrives? She asked. Probably not, admitted. We're moving our operations far beyond the galactic rim. Most of our fleet will be stationed in the void, preparing defensive positions and building weapons platforms. We'll maintain some monitoring stations in council space, but our personnel will keep a low profile. And after you win? Ra asked, surprising herself with her confidence in human victory. His chuckle carried genuine warmth. After we win, ma'am, we'll probably withdraw again. Give the galaxy a chance to forget how terrible we can be when necessity demands it. Maybe in another 300 years, you'll need us to answer another SOS call. The transmission ended, leaving the chamber in tense silence. Around her, Ra could see the other ambassadors struggling to process what they had learned. The humans were preparing for a war that wouldn't begin for 2 centuries, using weapons that could destroy solar systems, against an enemy that had already conquered at least one galaxy. And they were doing it alone, in the cold depths of space between the stars, so that the civilized species could continue their peaceful existence without having to witness the horrible necessities of survival. As the emergency session dissolved into smaller groups of worried representatives, Ra made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She was going to ensure that when this new threat finally arrived, humanity wouldn't face it entirely alone. Not because the humans needed help, but because the galaxy needed to remember that freedom always came with a price. And sometimes, that price had to be paid in the currency that humans understood better than anyone: controlled, calculated, necessary violence. 200 years later, Ambassador Ra was gone, long dead from old age. Her successor's successor now stood in the same chamber where the original call to humanity had been made, staring at readings that comprehension. Ambassador was young by council standards, barely 50 years old, but she carried the weight of her predecessor's legacy. The private records that Ra had maintained contained detailed files on humanity's final warning, along with her own analysis of what was coming. Most of the current council had dismissed these records as the fantasies of an old diplomat who had become obsessed with human mythology. They weren't laughing now. Ma'am, Chief Analyst Al called from his station, his voice tight with fear. Long-range sensors have detected massive gravitational distortions at the galactic rim. Whatever's out there, it's bigger than our most pessimistic projections. Study the tactical display with growing horror. The sensors were detecting something that stretched across multiple star systems. Not ships or fleets, but structures so vast they seemed to be composed of entire solar systems rearranged into geometric patterns. How long until it reaches inhabited space? She asked. At current approach speed, approximately 6 months, Al replied. But ma'am, the energy readings suggest it's still accelerating. It could reach the core worlds in as little as 3 months. 3 months? Felt her heart skip as she realized the timeline matched exactly with Admiral's 200-year-old prediction. The humans had been right about everything. Any word from the human territories? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Nothing, ma'am. We haven't detected any human activity in council space for the past 50 years. Their monitoring stations went dark decades ago. Nodded grimly. The humans had withdrawn completely, disappearing into the void beyond the galactic rim to fight a war that most species had forgotten was coming. For 2 centuries, the galaxy had enjoyed peace and prosperity while humanity prepared for hell. Send the message, she ordered. Ma'am, Al asked. The emergency beacon, the same frequency we used before, send it now. As the transmission burst outward toward empty space, wondered if there would be anyone left to receive it. 200 years was a long time to fight a war in the darkness between galaxies. For all they knew, humanity had been extinct for decades, their final battle fought and lost in the cold void where no one would ever know what had happened to them. The answer came 3 hours later. Galactic Council, this is Admiral of the Human Federation Defense Force. We received your transmission. The voice was different from younger and with a slight accent that couldn't identify, but it carried the same unmistakable confidence. We're currently engaged with the primary threat approximately 2 million light-years from your position. The situation is complex. Nearly collapsed with relief, they were still alive. After 2 centuries of war in the void, the humans were still fighting. Admiral, this is Ambassador. Can you give us a status report on the threat level? His pause was longer than comfortable. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Ambassador, the entity approaching your galaxy is called the Devourers. They're not a species in any sense you would understand. They're a collective intelligence made up of the harvested consciousness of every species they've ever encountered. The implications hit like a physical blow. They absorb their victims. Worse than that, they trap them in eternal suffering while using their knowledge and abilities to make themselves stronger. Every species the Devourers have conquered is still alive inside that thing, conscious and aware but unable to die. His voice grew harder. We've been fighting them for 200 years, and we've learned they can't be negotiated with, reasoned with, or appeased. They have to be completely destroyed down to the last quantum bit of data. What's the current tactical situation? Asked. We've managed to slow them down significantly and destroyed about 60% of their forward elements. But they keep adapting, incorporating our weapons and tactics into their own systems. Every victory we achieve makes them stronger in the long run. Paused. We need to end this quickly before they adapt enough to become unstoppable. What can the Council do to help? His answer surprised everyone in the command center. We need you to evacuate, all of you. Every civilian population in the galaxy needs to be moved beyond the outer rim within the next 90 days. Admiral, that's impossible, protested. There are trillions of beings in Council space. We don't have enough ships to evacuate even a fraction of that number. Then we'll provide them, said simply. We've been building evacuation fleets for the past 50 years, just in case. Human transport ships are already en route to major population centers. Your job is to coordinate with local authorities and ensure orderly boarding procedures. Stared at the communication console in amazement. The humans had been planning for this contingency for half a century, building refugee fleets capable of evacuating the entire galactic population. Admiral, how is this possible? The resource requirements alone. Ambassador, we've had 200 years to strip mine every uninhabited system within 10,000 light-years. We've built an industrial capacity that spans multiple galaxy clusters. Evacuating your population is well within our capabilities. His tone became more urgent. But we need to start immediately. The Devourers have begun deploying advanced scouts that can move much faster than their main body. As if summoned by her words, alarm bells began ringing throughout the command center. Al's voice cracked as he read his instruments. Ma'am, multiple contacts appearing throughout Council space. They're materializing directly inside our star systems, bypassing all perimeter defenses. The tactical display filled with red dots as Devourer scouts appeared near major population centers. But even as watched in horror, new contacts began appearing in response. Massive human ships dropping out of FTL drive directly above inhabited worlds. Admiral, she called urgently, the scouts are attacking civilian targets. Copy that, Ambassador. Human Defense Force engaging. His voice carried across all frequencies as she addressed her fleet. All vessels, weapons free. Priority is civilian protection. Do not let any scout reach a populated world. What followed was the most one-sided battle in galactic history. The Devourer scouts were individually powerful, each one capable of destroying an entire star system. But the humans had learned from 2 centuries of fighting these things. Their weapons were precisely calibrated to exploit every weakness, their tactics perfected through endless trial and error in the void. The scouts were eliminated in minutes. Threat neutralized, reported. Evacuation ships are moving to pick up positions now. Ambassador, we're transmitting evacuation protocols to all Council governments. I need you to ensure compliance. Anyone who refuses to evacuate will be dead within 60 days. Over the following weeks, witnessed the most incredible logistical operation in galactic history. Massive human ships, each one capable of carrying millions of refugees, appeared at every inhabited world. The humans had clearly studied the biology and environmental needs of every species in the galaxy, because their evacuation vessels were perfectly configured for each population they were rescuing. But it wasn't just the ships that impressed her, it was the humans themselves. The evacuation crews were professional, efficient, and surprisingly gentle with frightened refugees. They spoke dozens of languages, understood cultural protocols, and went out of their way to ensure that families stayed together and precious artifacts were preserved. When a group of philosophers refused to leave without their ancient manuscripts, human soldiers spent hours carefully packing every document. When children became terrified of the strange ships, human crew members painted friendly designs on the walls and organized games to keep them calm. "Admiral," said during one of their daily briefings, "your people are showing remarkable compassion for beings they barely know." His response was quiet but firm. "Ambassador, we've spent 2 centuries fighting an enemy that turns compassion into a weapon. We've seen what happens when hope and kindness are perverted into tools of torture. These evacuations remind us what we're fighting to protect." The evacuation proceeded faster than anyone had thought possible. Within 60 days, every major population center had been cleared. The human transport fleets carried their precious cargo beyond the galactic rim to refugee camps that had been prepared in star systems so distant they weren't on any council map. But not everyone made it out. Approximately 10,000 volunteers from various species chose to remain behind, despite knowing they faced certain death. They were researchers, historians, and philosophers who wanted to document the final battle for future generations. They were soldiers who couldn't bear to retreat without fighting, and they were simply individuals who had decided that some things were worth dying for. The humans accepted these volunteers without argument, integrating them into their own forces where possible and providing the others with the best defensive positions they could create. "Final evacuation ships departing galactic space," Admiral reported on the 70th day. "All civilian populations have been successfully relocated. Human Defense Force is taking positions for final engagement." Watching from a command ship safely beyond the rim, saw the human fleet for the first time in its full glory. Over 2 centuries of preparation had created something that description. Ships the size of moons, weapon platforms built around entire stars, artificial intelligence networks that span light years. The humans hadn't just built a fleet, they had turned the void itself into a weapon. "Admiral," she said over the communication link, "on behalf of every species you've saved today, thank you." His response carried across every ship in the refugee fleet. "Don't thank us yet, Ambassador. Thank us when we come home." The final battle began 3 days later, and it was visible even from their distant refuge. Entire star systems lit up as weapons were unleashed that could unmake reality itself. Space twisted and folded as the humans deployed their most terrible creations, devices that turned the laws of physics into ammunition. The battle lasted for 6 months. When it ended, the silence was absolute. For weeks, the refugee fleet waited for word from the human forces. Long-range sensors detected nothing but empty space where the battle had been fought. No ships, no energy readings, no trace of either human or devourer forces. Then, just as hope was beginning to fade, a single transmission reached them from the battlefield. "Refugee fleet, this is Admiral. The devourers have been completely eliminated. All human vessels are accounted for, though we took significant casualties." There was a long pause, filled with static and interference. "The galaxy is safe. You can go home." When the refugee ships finally returned to their home worlds, they found something extraordinary waiting for them. The humans had apparently spent their final months before the battle terraforming and improving every world in Council space. Planets that had been marginal were now lush and fertile. Damaged ecosystems had been completely restored. Even the architecture had been improved, with human engineering enhancing the beauty and functionality of every major city. But the humans themselves were gone again. Their fleet had departed immediately after the battle, vanishing once more into the depths of space. They left behind only a simple message, broadcast on every communication frequency in the galaxy. "The universe is vast and full of wonders, but it's also full of dangers that most civilized species can't even imagine. We'll be out here, in the dark between the stars, making sure those dangers never reach you. Build your societies, raise your children, create beauty and knowledge and hope. We'll handle the monsters." Ambassador stood in her restored office on Council Prime, looking out at a sky that sparkled with unfamiliar constellation star systems that the humans had apparently rearranged to optimize trade routes and communication networks. The galaxy was more beautiful than it had ever been, and it was safe because somewhere in the darkness, humans were standing guard. She activated her communication system and began recording a message for future generations. To whoever leads the council when the next darkness comes, and it will come because darkness always does, remember that we are not alone. Somewhere in the void, the humans are watching and waiting. They ask nothing from us except that we live good lives and be worthy of the protection they provide. When the time comes to send another SOS call, do not hesitate. They will answer. They always answer, because that's what humans do. The message ended, and returned to her work of governing a galaxy that lived in peace because others chose to live at war. Somewhere beyond the rim, in places where stars were too distant to warm any world, the human war giants stood their eternal watch. And the universe was safer for it,